growing trend in sports nutrition is that every athlete's body is unique. At the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, we are working to help athletes and their influencers better understand these differences so they can better fuel their bodies. GSSI has a variety of tools to accomplish this, from testing the unique attributes of each athlete to nutrition personalization programs and educational outreach. GSSI is striving to make sure athletes and their influencers are more informed about their nutritional needs than ever before. GSSI is also an educational resource for sports health professionals. Athletic trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, registered dietitians and sports scientists all turn to GSSI to gain insights into the latest research and strategies that they can put to use with their own athletes. Whether it's in the lab or on the field, online or offline, GSSI is giving athletes and their influencers an invaluable look at how nutrition and hydration can change their game, help them reach their goals, and become the best they can be.
So, hello everyone. Good afternoon, good evening or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And we're so excited to start this series of GSSI Fuel School webinars. And we've got a great lineup today, but before we begin, I'd just like to start by introducing myself and also to give you some background on the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. So firstly, I am Dr. Rebecca Randall. I've been with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute for 8 years, and I'm currently a senior scientist. I'll be moderating this session, so if you've got any questions throughout the hour, please just type them into the Q&A box and we'll try and answer as many as possible. So GSSI's philosophy has been the same since it was first established as the Gatorade Exercise Physiology Lab in 1985, which is conducting research and athlete testing in both the lab and on the field of play. And our long-standing mission is to help athletes optimize their health and performance through research and education in hydration and nutrition science. In total, we have 28 full-time exercise and nutrition scientists based largely in the US, with a smaller team based in England who oversee all of our international work. But our international work would not be possible without this amazing group of global advisors, some of who are talking for us today and will be presenting during this webinar series. Now, at GSSI, we are continuously finding ways to spread the science of hydration and nutrition to sport and health professionals, coaches, nutritionists, and sports communities all over the world. So the aim of the GSSI Fuel School is to do just that. And in these challenging times, which is currently affecting all of us, we want to ensure that we can continue to educate more sports professionals than ever. So as I said, today we have an amazing lineup. We'll be hearing 2 fantastic talks by Dr. Molly Malari and Dr. Jason Lee. Each speaker has 20 minutes, although we are quite tight on time already, and we should hopefully have some time after both speakers have presented for questions and answers. So that's definitely enough from me. Let's begin. Our first speaker is Dr. Molly Malari. Dr. Malari completed her PhD in sports science, majoring in sports nutrition, from the College of Sports Science and Technology at Mahidol University in Thailand. And she is now an associate professor at the University of Philippines. Dr. Malari is a former competitive dragon boat rower, badminton player and mountaineer, and her research interests include studies on collegiate athletes, beverage intake behaviours and hydration related to performance and recovery. Today, Dr. Malari is going to talk to us on the importance of hydration and hydration recommendations. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Malari, and the virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. So we're going to start with our discussion on the importance of hydration and the recommendations. I'd like to first say hello and welcome to the first Asia Pacific Hydration e-workshop. Take hydration for granted. Topics to be discussed today will be on the importance of hydration, and we'll hopefully address some relevant issues on this matter. We will also be giving some simple hydration guidelines. To start, we will look at the main reason why hydration is important, this being our body water. Next slide. So water is a component of the human body. As we know, in fact, water accounts for approximately 40 to 60% body weight in the average adult. Body water plays an important role in numerous physiological processes. It functions as a solvent and provides means of transportation of materials throughout the body. So what this means is that water is important for excretion of waste, blood volume, blood pressure regulation, transport of oxygen and nutrients to the brain and exercising muscles, and water also plays an important role in body temperature regulation by transferring heat out of the body. Next slide, please. Hydration is important for cardiovascular function, body temperature regulation, and performance. Body water and sodium are for rehydration. Fluid intake needs can be estimated by changes in body weight. During exercise, the recommendation is to drink enough fluid to avoid significant dehydration. And after exercise, the recommendation is to drink 24 ounces of fluid per 1 pound deficit if rapid rehydration is needed. Now, next slide, please. Temperature, humidity, environment, training status, they all play a role in one's hydration status, which includes how well you maintain body water or how fast you might dehydrate during exercise. To help maintain hydration, specific components of the rehydration beverage impact various steps in the hydration process. Hydration is a process that starts with ingestion, followed by absorption of the fluid through the intestines, distribution of the fluid throughout the body, including your blood and your cells, and finally, retention or excretion of the fluid by the kidneys. During the rest of this presentation, I will take you through the various factors that affect these four processes. But first, let's talk about one of the things, which is thirst. The sensation of physiological thirst is stimulated by either a decrease in the amount of water in the blood, also called hypovolemia, or by increased plasma osmolality, which is the concentration of dissolved particles such as sodium or glucose sugar particles in the blood. Both of these changes occur during dehydration due to sweating. The perception of thirst can also be increased or decreased by signals arising from the mouth, throat, and stomach. However, other factors can also affect how much fluid an athlete consumes. These include how much an athlete likes a beverage, its availability, as well as social and cultural factors. Like, for example, an athlete may opt to drink a beverage that is also the choice of his or her peers, or maybe choose what's considered the norm for the region. Let's say the popularity of tea in the UK and China. Next slide, please. Thirst lags behind fluid needs. Here is a graphic to illustrate this concept. As you can see on the x-axis, we have plasma osmolality. As a reminder, osmolality is the concentration of dissolved particles in the blood. On the left-hand y-axis, we have ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, represented by the yellow dot. ADH secretion is a signal of dehydration that is sent to the kidneys in order to minimize urinary fluid loss. On the right-hand axis, we have individual ratings of thirst, usually measured using a visual analog scale. This is represented by a green triangle. So a well-hydrated person has a plasma osmolality of 285, as you can see on the graph. As dehydration increases, ADH also increases. However, ratings of thirst do not increase until, as you can see, 292. Thus, the threshold for thirst lags behind body hydration changes, and hence lags behind an athlete's true fluid needs. Next slide, please. This can lead to a phenomenon known as voluntary dehydration. This means that despite having easy access to cool palatable fluids, athletes still become dehydrated during exercise. They simply do not drink enough to maintain hydration during training or competition. After exercise, they replace some, but typically not all of their fluid losses. Research shows that voluntary dehydration occurs for athletes in endurance events and sports. To compound the problem, athletes commonly show up to practice or competition inadequately hydrated as well. To prevent significant dehydration, it's suggested that not more than 2% of body weight should be lost during training or competition. Body weight loss greater than 2% is associated with impaired performance. For example, one study showed that when dehydrated, basketball players lower in sprinting drills during a severe game. The same study showed that dehydration also impaired sport-specific skills, including shooting performance. Okay, next slide. There are a few simple ways by which athletes may check on their hydration status. Commonly used are the first morning urine color test, wherein a simple color P chart may be used to assess or urine-specific gravity, thirst as well, and body mass changes. It is ideal to make use of a combination of two measures for better accuracy in measurement. Changes in body mass before and after exercise reflects the amount of fluid loss during sweating. Next slide. So sweating is the main thermoregulatory means for us humans to cool ourselves. This is especially important for athletes during training and competition. It is also, however, the main reason for dehydration due to physical activity. To prevent dehydration, it is crucial to replace the fluid that we lost from sweating. Hence, the importance of measuring the athlete's sweat rate. We can help an athlete know their own sweat rate by monitoring body changes before and after exercise. We can assume 1 pound of lost weight is equal to about 16 ounces of fluid. In order to estimate sweat rate in liters per hour, add weight loss and fluid consumed during exercise divided by the duration. To be most accurate, conduct a test in the environment where the athlete typically trains and competes. Measure athlete weight calculations. A fluid loss calculator may be used, such as the one on the GSSI site. You may visit gssiweb.org for a fluid loss calculator tool. So to summarize what we have talked about so far on fluid intake, relying solely on thirst to gauge fluid needs can lead to under or over drinking, both of which should be avoided. Thus, the best efforts to have a planned hydration strategy is recommended. So this involves your sweat rate and drinking enough fluid to prevent a significant in body weight. So next, we'll talk about the process of fluid absorption. This means getting fluid from the gastrointestinal tract into the bloodstream. This process involves emptying of fluid out of the stomach as well as transport of fluids across the intestinal wall. The rate at which these processes occur is important in order to avoid gastrointestinal distress and for rapid delivery of fluid to the body. Next slide. The rate of gastric emptying is controlled by numerous factors, including beverage amount, beverage composition, and exercise intensity. One of the more important factors is the amount of calories in the ingested beverage. Calories in beverages is determined by the amount of carbohydrate it contains. For example, a 6% carbohydrate solution, such as Gatorade Thirst Quencher, contains 6 grams of carbohydrate and about 240 calories. About 320 calories per liter of fluid. One study compared the gastric emptying rate of sports drinks ingested the equal amount, 6% or an 8% carbohydrate solution. To determine the effect of carbohydrate concentration on gastric emptying, the investigators measured the volume of ingested beverage remaining in the stomach after 90 minutes of emptied as quickly as water. However, there was more of the 8% carbohydrate solution remaining in the stomach, resulting in gastrointestinal distress as well as slower the body. The process of intestinal fluid absorption is not only dictated by the amount, but also the type of carbohydrate ingested. The inclusion of multiple types of carbohydrates, such as glucose and fructose, as opposed to just glucose, can improve fluid absorption. Just think of it utilizing more carbohydrate transporters simultaneously so that more carbohydrates may be absorbed at the same time. If the ingested beverage contains both glucose and fructose, then the GLUT5 transporter is also used instead of just GLUT4. And since the absorption of water follows carbohydrate absorption, then multiple transportable carbohydrates also speed water absorption. The presence of sodium in a fluid replacement beverage is also important. Sodium is the primary extracellular electrolyte, so consuming sodium during exercise helps maintain intra- and extracellular sodium concentration. One important function is holding on to the water component of our plasma, or whole body fluid retention, which is related to maintaining a hydrated state. When an athlete is rehydrating after exercise, we want the fluid to stay in the body. When plain water is consumed, it dilutes blood sodium concentration, which turns off the signal to the kidney to reabsorb water. This results in increased urine volume. By contrast, when a sodium beverage absorption of water in the kidneys, so that less urine. Fluid retention increases in direct proportion to beverage sodium concentration. For example, one study has compared different sodium-containing beverages and found that urine volume decreased progressively as sodium concentration went from low to moderate to high concentration. Not only is beverage composition important, so is the pattern of fluid intake. Waiting to drink until after dehydration has already accrued, like drinking to thirst, could affect GI comfort. Studies have shown that greater than or equal to 3% dehydration results in delayed emptying from the stomach and increase your intestinal distress. Train the gut to accept fluids. Stomach comfort and fluid tolerance can The volume of fluid consumed during rehydration is also an important consideration. One study dehydrated athletes to about % body weight deficit through exercise and heat stress. Then the investigators had the athletes consume a volume of sports drink equivalent to either 50%, 100%, 150%, and 200% of their fluid loss. 6 hours after ingestion, overall fluid balance was negative with 50% and 100% groups. However, during the 150% trial, fluid balance was restored to baseline. They also found that there's no clear advantage to drinking more than 150% of fluid loss. Experts therefore recommend that to achieve rapid and complete rehydration after exercise, athletes should consume a moderate to high sodium beverage in a volume equivalent to 100. Next slide, please. All right. During exercise, everybody's fluid needs are different. The average sweat rate is about 1 liter per hour, but we really can't make general recommendations. To figure out the amount of fluid to drink during exercise, base it on a 16 ounce per pound loss. And for recovery, an athlete should drink 150% of fluid loss, or about 20 to 24 ounces per pound loss. In the Philippines, translated to 1.5 liters per kilogram loss to account for continued sweating and urination post-exercise. To summarize, maintaining hydration status is important because this will affect their overall performance in training and competition. It is recommended to minimize weight loss due to exercise-induced dehydration. This includes knowing each individual athlete's sweat rate to better replenish water loss through sweating. Rehydrate after exercise 24 ounces per pound loss with a beverage containing sodium to help retain fluid in the body. That's all for our hydration basics. Thank you for participating in the GSSI Fuel School Hydration e-workshop. Get to take a peek into the GSSI website for a wealth of information regarding hydration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. I know we had a few connectivity issues, but all of these presentations will be available to watch following this webinar, so there's the opportunity to rewatch the presentations. One thing that always amazes me is the difference in sweat rate. I've had quite a lot of experience of working with athletes, and it always amazes me when they do the same exercise drill or training and their sweat rates are so completely different. So it's really fascinating what you covered this morning or this afternoon, Molly. So let's move on to our next talk, who is going to be delivered by Dr. Jason Lee. Dr. Lee has a wealth of experience in thermoregulation and hydration sciences. Dr. Lee obtained his first degree in sports and exercise sciences from Loughborough University in the United Kingdom, where he stayed on to complete his PhD in exercise physiology. Dr. Lee is currently an associate professor at the National University of Singapore, and he sits on various local and international committees related to health, performance and safety. Today, Dr. Lee is going to talk to us on the physiological strategies to optimize endurance running in the heat. Dr. Lee, a personal thank you for being a part of our first GSSI Fuel School webinar, and the stage is set for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, for your kind introduction, and thank you
Molly, I think you set the stage nicely for me to come in at this stage for the next 20 minutes of presentation. What I'm attempting to do, I'll be attempting to do is to contextualize the evidence-based theoretical frameworks and concepts and map it to the data we have acquired from these parts of the world. I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, if you're talking about APAC, most of us will experience warm and humid environment. So I think I would share a bit about the physiological strategies, but bear in mind, there are other strategies that we can harness to beat the heat. So there are behavioral strategies, there are engineering solutions, you know, but for this 20 minutes talk, I will focus on a couple of physiological strategies to beat the heat. Next slide, please. So I have just two main points to cover in this presentation. I'll first talk about the thermal and fluid demands, and I'll conclude my talk by what I call the combinational approach to harness two of the well-known strategies to beat the heat. Next slide, please. So here you see 3 points here. I will just be focusing on heat stress and fluid balance. Bear in mind, energy availability is equally important. But if you zoom out, don't go away and just assuming that if you know how to beat the heat, if you hydrate well, if you eat well on a race day, you're good to go. Yeah, the foundation of a good strategy and a good dietary approach is first get the basic right. Eat well, rest well. If you do that, harness a bit of sports nutrition tips, to give you that boost. If you need that cutting edge, you know you are deficit in certain elements, then you supplement accordingly. So it's not the other way around. Get the foundation right before you top it out with each of these strategies. So I'll focus first on heat stress or hypothermia in this case. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is a classic experiment done quite some time back that clearly showed if you compare 3 different ambient conditions, in this case, hot depicted by 40 degrees Celsius, neutral 20 degrees Celsius, and cold at 3 degrees C. You can see that it's very clear that exercise time was reduced as the temperature gets warmer. So this is a classic findings, and it has been repeated over a few times. It's quite convincing. When you get hot, you just cannot last that long. Even if we switch this to another modality, what we call exercise performance, i.e. a fixed distance you could complete as quick as possible with higher ecological validity. It's the same outcome. When you're hot, you just cannot go as fast. So this is quite well understood. I will share with you their own set of findings from this part of the world. And what is impressive is even minute differences in ambient temperature can slow us down too. Next slide, please. So here, about 6-7 years back, we supported the local medical support, quite rich data set we acquired. But I will just focus on the performance elements based on this series of profiling we did over 6-7 years. I'll focus on the number of finishes and the performance on well-trained athletes. Next slide, please. So here I want to guide you on the y-axis. You see the overall number of finishes. On the x-axis, look at the maximum dry bulk temperature. And if we line up in terms of ascending order from 27.9 degrees Celsius to 32 degrees Celsius. I'm sorry, that's the best we can do in Singapore. It's always this sort of range, considered warm and humid here. But what is most impressive in this set of data, we saw that even minute differences in ambient temperature can have an effect on our number of finishes in this case. So as the temperature creeps up a little bit, you can see the number of finishes decrease accordingly, and 1% here represents about 500 runners. So generally, you see that trend. This shows that humans are actually quite sensitive to heat stress. You don't run yourself to heat injury when the temperature gets warmer. And then the first response is you will slow down, and the price to pay in this case is either you don't finish the race if it gets too hot, or you slow down accordingly. Next slide, please. This is a very small set of data, but very premium set of data, because here we look at the top 5 runners for each race, for each races here. So there are 4 races here. And so that both the male elite runners depicted by top 5 runners for each category were affected with even smaller change in ambient temperature. Before this set of data, you assume 24.6, and to the extreme end, 26 degrees Celsius will be pretty much similar. But what is impressive here from a field perspective, we saw even such a minute difference in ambient temperature can have an effect on even well-trained athletes. Of course, the absolute time difference was much smaller in this elite group as compared to the recreational athletes, but still, even you are very well-trained, you are not protected in terms of performance during racing in a hot and humid environment. Next slide, please. So I quickly talk about heat stress. I'll move on to fluid balance in the context of a warm and humid racing. Next slide, please. So again, to run through some of the concepts that Molly has very clearly brought us through, the evaporation of sweat. If you pick it out, it's like as a bowl, in terms of, I bold it to say that it's an evaporation of sweat, just to drive across the point. Sweat per se does not lose heat. You have to have the ability of the environment to allow the evaporation to take place. Dehydration, minute dehydration might not pay the price, but once you get excessively dehydrated, then you can guarantee both performance and health will be compromised. But what is tricky here, as we heard earlier, that it is not straightforward in terms of the so what. We sweat very differently. And therefore, this personalization, this prescription is warranted, because we just don't sweat the same. The next slide will show this. Next slide, please. So here we sort of control for these 4 key determinants of sweating in this group of similar profile runners. They finished this race, I remember, in between 90 minutes to 1 hour and 45 minutes. So quite homogeneously trained. They were all from Singapore. We even enforced the same attire on them. And based on their VO2 max and finishing time, the exercise intensity was quite similar. And obviously, they raced in the same race. And here you see the dots. You could see one guy that is less than 1 liters per hour, about 0.8. And you could see someone that sweat about 2.2, 2.3 liters per hour. So one size clearly does not fit all. Next slide, please. So here is another effort across a series of 6-7 years that we collected quite a rich set of data in terms of body mass loss as an estimation of dehydration. I could stay on this slide and talk for the next 15 minutes, but I just want you to focus. While there is this concern of dehydration, I sort of like circle in red. There are to date runners who are still not well educated. It has the ability to put on body mass at the end of the race. This is a big no-no. I casually joke with the race organizers, that the tenacity of these runners are superb. It's not easy to put on body mass at the end of a race, especially a long race. So in a way, they deserve 2 medals and 2 T-shirts instead of 1 set, for their tenacity to abide by hydration guidelines. In this case, overdoing it, that resulted in a body mass gains at the end of the race. So bear in mind that as much as we are educating that you shouldn't get dehydrated because performance and at times health may be compromised, you shouldn't swing to the other end of the spectrum where you think that the more, the merrier. Next slide, please. So again, we took the opportunity in one of the efforts to profile the body mass loss recently in a set of elite runners. And the blue triangles here depicts the male elite runners, and the red color symbols represent the female runners. what is it interesting here, you could see a high degree of dehydration. Of course, this is a single profiling, so there's no way for us to answer the question. If only they were more hydrated and to prevent such high degree of dehydration, would they do better? We could answer that question, and we could only answer that high degree of body mass loss, i.e. dehydration, seems to be tolerable in well-trained athletes. So again, one size does not fit all. It might depend on the environment, the intensity, in this case, the training status of the cohort of interest. So again, you might think it's let's go about making them drink more. We understand this evidence of training the gut, drinking more, but bear in mind from a performance element, we make sure that they do not slow down. We do not over prescribe that they have to lose more time at more intervals. They got to pick up the drink. So it's a very fine balance that you want to maintain the physiology, a good physiology in relation to the good outcome, but yet not putting it as if that you want a beautiful physiology at the end of the day, but they don't win the race. Yeah. So from a performance angle, they're trying to find the sweet spot. Almost if you twist the question the other way, is what is the degree of dehydration I can tolerate, yet achieving my best performance outcome. So there's a need to personalize our hydration guidelines, especially you are competing at a very high level. Next slide, please. So I finished the first part. I will quickly round out my talk to give you some tips in terms of the strategies to beat the heats in the context of endurance running. Next slide. So this is a conceptual framework, and it is evidence-based. But again, there's a lot of richness in this slide. I want you to understand that each of the physiological strategies must address the efficacy via reduction of resting core temperature or attenuation of body temperature during exercise or the extension. Because by doing so, if you observe the y-axis, we call the heat capacity now can be expanded accordingly if your strategy managed to do one of these three things. By expanding to the y-axis, then your exercise or your endurance capacity on the x-axis can be extended accordingly. Next slide, please. These are 5 common strategies we use to beat the heat, largely physiological, except the one in the work-rest cycle. I would term it as a behavior strategies. But look at the 3 yellow boxes on the aerobic conditioning. You knew that this is one strategy that is most powerful because not only it reduce, it attenuate, at times it can extend your personal thermal limit. So that is, again, this gives you motivation in your next workout. Do one more round of interval because you know that nothing beats good, solid and aerobic conditioning. But my focus for the next few slides is to combine what we know as pre-activity cooling and hydration into a single strategy. Next slide, please. So here, if you see the black line on the extreme left, you can put it, so that is your control line. If you drink enough, stay hydrated, you can attenuate the rate of rise. On the gray line is a conceptual line to show that when you pre-cool, it does nothing except to lower your resting core temperature. But if you combine the blue and gray line, I call it as this combination effect, where you harness on the efficacy of hydration, the efficacy of pre-exercise cooling. Potentially, you can harness the goodness of these 2 strategies, which is depicted by the yellow line. Next slide, please. So a lot of focus has been on the mass of fluids ingested, which is important, how much you should drink before, during, and after exercise. But there are more goodness that we can squeeze out of what we ingest. In this case, maximizing the differential in temperature of the drinks ingested and your body temperature, and also harnessing the specific heat of the ingested fluids. Next slide, please. So here, one of the earlier studies to show, in this case, they are controlling against cold water, which itself is better than ambient or tepid temperature water. In this case, they were comparing against cold water, and it was very neatly shown that with ice slushy or ice slurry ingestion, it beats the cold water trial, and it further reduced the resting core temperature and resulted in enhancement in endurance capacity. Next slide, please. So again, when you see good results from the literature, you almost want to repeat that in your context, to verify, to validate the findings. And that was exactly what we attempted to do many years ago in Singapore. These sort of experiments can only be conducted in limited locations. Yeah, so do not attempt to do this in London, because one Saturday and the next Saturday will result in very different ambient conditions. So in this case, the ambient temperature in my context was pretty much the same. So we could have control and interventional trial in the within subject design. So without going through the details, we had 12 individuals. We asked them to run 10 kilometers as fast as possible. We measured their split time. We assessed their rating of perceived exertion and thermal sensation intermittently, and provide fluids at 3 stops just to simulate the actual race conditions. And we have then ingest the temperature capsule so we can measure the thermal strain with and without the ingestion of ice slurry. Next slide, please. So here you see the few dots. We managed to achieve that pre-cooling effect with ice slushy. And then because they felt good, they felt cool, they were able to produce higher metabolic rate. Therefore, they ran faster. So bear in mind, this is an endurance performance modality that when you feel good, you have the choice to run harder. And therefore, the higher heat strain here is not because they ingest ice slurry, but because they ran faster. 11 of the 12 runners ran faster when a bolus of ice slurry was ingested before the 10 kilometers race. Next slide. Okay, so the final slide, I just want to conclude very quickly so we have time for some Q&A, that the fluid volume required to induce positive physiological benefits is often not achieved in actual races. There's this theory or these recommendations, you got to train the guts to tolerate more. If you're uncomfortable drinking that much to replace the requirement, then you have to practice more during training so that you can do it during the race. But we shouldn't eradicate the possibility for certain individuals that often assume 2% might not be applied throughout. So again, going back to personalizations for nutrition, for sports nutrition, it is important that above which then the price will be paid, and then that is where you do not want the athlete to go beyond. The second point in my presentation, I hope I have quickly and clearly shown the efficacy of ice slurry ingestion. Essentially, if you use a commercially available sports drinks, you are harnessing the ingredients. But in this case, by making it ice slushy, you're also maximizing its efficacy by serving as a heat sink. The beauty of it is most athletes do not want to ingest huge amount of fluid while they are racing, so you can achieve the same heat sink with a lesser amount of fluid ingested. And you don't have to manipulate, you don't have to make your own cocktail of ice slushy. You can just take what is out there, put it into an ice slushy machine, and it should make beautiful ice slushies. Thank you very much for your attention. I shall pass the time back to Rebecca. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. I really liked your point about the importance of education to not only reduce dehydration, but also to prevent that overhydration. And I think the next time that I want to do an extra running interval, I'll think of you, and I'll know that it's really important to do it. So thank you for that information. We have had some questions in. First of all, if I could start with you, Molly. We've talked about personalized hydration plans in terms of maybe fluid, but do you think it would be best to have a drink that's tailor fitted to one's sweat type, so we know that we lose electrolytes as well? So if an athlete has a high sodium sweat sodium content, should we be changing our drinks according to that?
I missed some of the points in your question, but I think I can guess what it is that you're trying to ask me. It's actually all right to get a drink from the stores, from the stalls. as long as it contains a certain amount of carbohydrate and sodium as well. There lies the importance of course, checking the sweat sodium of athletes, especially if they're high sweaters or they sweat a lot, because they could be needing more of the sodium in their drink. So I hope I answered your question, Becca.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Molly. We've actually had a really interesting question come in. We've had. Oh, we thought the dog might turn up at some point. We've had two questions come in, which I'm going to try and combine. And Jason, I know you've done a bit of work on this, so maybe I'll direct it to you. We had a question in from Samir, who asked if there's difference in hydration or dehydration, or maybe sweat rate, depending on the colour of somebody's skin, and also if there's gender differences as well.
Yeah.
Regarding
definitely
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that regarding gender
Jason.
difference, clearly, yeah, we know that the female generally sweat lesser as compared to male. But again, I would not want to take that as a general prescription. I think it is still important for us to quantify that person, may it be a male or female, in the exact activity of interest. And because it could be a male, but it's in the more favorable environment for sweat evaporation versus the male, who is in operating in a protective gear and therefore induces more sweat. So I would recommend that we prescribe based on the context of that sporting context of which he or she is undergoing by measuring the sweat loss.
Yeah, I agree as well.
And I think Molly showed on one of her slides all the different factors that can influence sweat rate as well. Yeah. So it's not just, we have to take all of those things into consideration. And yeah. Jason, I wonder whether you could talk about the ethnicity, maybe differences in sweat rates.
Yeah, there's not very robust evidence or data to show the differences in ethnicity in relation to the sweat rates. But if you look at from a joke, the ethnicity is at times very closely linked to where you are from on the mat, i.e. your geographical locations. If you're a hot and humid environment, you will assume that these individuals are more heat acclimatized. But again, I will put a word of caution, again, using my own context here. Many assume that all Singaporeans or Filipinos are very well heat acclimatized. But remember, the most powerful way to protect ourselves is what I call the behavior response. When you're chronically in a hot and humid environment, you know it is not pleasant to stay out there, and therefore you could spend a lot of time indoors. And also there is this hypothesis that individuals who are living in developed countries especially, you might be spending too much time indoor that you're actually not heat acclimatized after all. So again, measure it to be sure, do not make assumption. Yeah.
Did you have something to add there, Molly?
To your, your indoor, the temperature indoors. So when you go out, you still feel, really hot and humid, right? So deacclimatization really can happen as well. Yeah, great, Jason.
Thanks. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and we've had a question come in from the Q&A from Sancho. It's for you, Dr. Lee, and it's regarding the environment and heat and performance. Is it assumed that athletes who perform well or they reach the finish line in a hot environment should be able to perform better in a cold environment?
Yeah, I think there's good data in recent years that harness strategies to compete athletes in a warm environment, now reapplying those same training or adaptations to a cold environment. If we simplify this, is essentially adding a stressor to your training regime, right? A more well-known strategy called hypoxic training. Same concept, you're just inducing stress, and therefore we adapt accordingly, and bang, you will perform much better in the absence of hypoxic environment. So in this case, that if you train in a hot environment, it serves as another stressor to work your body harder. And you can assume that when you compete in the core environment without that stressor, you know, if you do it well, you should be able to compete better if you train well in a hot environment.
So I guess what we need is for you to send me some of that hot weather over to England, and that will help me, right?
I will.
I'll take some of the heat. Okay, well, we're near time. I can't believe that's been an hour already. Dr. Malari, Dr. Lee, thank you so much for keeping to time. You were spot on with your 20 minutes. And thank you so much for speaking today, and also for all the attendees joining. As I said, this is the first in a series of webinars that we are putting on. In 2 weeks' time, on the 11th of August, we'll have our second webinar on fuel for performance. Again, we've got 2 great speakers. It will be a similar format as today. So if you can, please join us by registering using the same link as you did before. So I guess that's it. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and enjoy the rest of your day.